Great to have you listening in today. As with previous seasons, it is my hope that the guests and their stories that I get to share with you this season can provide you with the tools and or insights that you need to know that you can make it through whatever is happening for you now. And not only that you can have the life you want in whatever way you want that to look like. So let's get to it. I'm your host, Helen Morris, and this is the beautiful side of grief. In this episode, we are talking about the ever-increasing and important subject of suicide. Now, if this is a topic that may be distressing or triggering to you, please use your discretion. And if you do feel triggered, please ensure you seek immediate support from friends or family or professional support if required. However, it is my intention that this episode be an open discussion on how you can move through this incredibly distressing time in your life to healing and being able to view both your loved one and yourself in a different light. It's about being a beacon of light to those who feel the despair by sharing these particular stories responsibly so you know that there is a way through this. My guest, Peggy Green, knows this journey so very well. She has faced a parent's worst nightmare, not once, but twice, losing 2 children, Courtney as a youngster in an accident, and then, much later, her son Connor by suicide. Yet, here she is, able to function in a positive, healthy way. And not only doing that, she is helping others find joy, peace, and happiness in their lives also. She does this through her website, spelled THEEE, Grief Specialist, as a speaker on her child loss experiences, and through her books Life After Child Loss, The Mother's Survivor Guide to Cope and Find Joy, and Survive Your Child's Suicide, How to Move through Grief to Healing. It's the latter we're going to be focusing on in this episode to help you find some strategies to help you with this often very messy, complex issue of suicide, and discover how you can move to a place of happiness once again. So welcome back, Peggy. We got to have a chat probably about March last year, I think, and it's absolutely lovely to be chatting with you again. So thanks for reaching out, and I'm excited to be discussing your new book.
Yeah, Helen, thank you so much for having me again. And when we spoke the first time, I had no idea that there was a second book in me, a second book to be written. And so now it's my honor and my pleasure to be able to come back and share with you and share with your audience really some more ways to be able to help you in, like you said, this terrible, complex, tragic time of suicide, child suicide. So thanks for having me on again.
Oh, you are so very welcome. And I think I'm a passionate believer that this is a difficult topic to talk about, and it is sensitive, and people have a lot of emotion and feelings around it. But I think it is so, so important to have it out in the open and just be having these conversations like we're going to be having. So let's talk about your book, Survive Your Child Suicide, How to Move Through Grief to Healing. So this is very appropriate. We're just in October. We've just gone through the month of September, which is Suicide Awareness Month. And you released your book in that month. I want to know what prompted you to find that second book within you and to write about something so complex and messy.
Yeah, Helen, the story behind that is really quite interesting to me. And the way it came about actually is as having had 2 children pass away and my son passing away by suicide in 2018, that was the catalyst for my first book. And, I also had, as you mentioned, Courtney passed away 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, there wasn't much resources. There wasn't much help. Child loss was the elephant in the room and nobody spoke about it. And so I navigated my way through that. I fumbled my way through it. And then when my son passed away, I also realized that there was still lack of resources when it came to child suicide. And it was only after a year that I wrote my first book. And then I was continuing my grief journey, and I sought to participate in some grief groups. And those grief groups just did not meet my needs. And
why was that, Peggy? What was lacking in those grief groups for you?
Well, I really felt that the people in the group and the format of the group was so much focused just on the people that were in there were stuck in that it was just on a hamster wheel, and I wasn't seeing any progress. And I knew that I needed to be able to move forward. I knew that I needed to be able to resume my life and regain my peace, joy, and happiness. So it just wasn't serving me. And even the child loss was that elephant. And then the child suicide made it even more difficult. They had their grief and I had mine. And at that time, I needed a little bit more connection with those who were similar. And I found by writing my first book that it was very healing, and it gave me something to focus on, help me to get through. And in my first book, I didn't address specifically suicide. Yeah. And suicide is unique. It's complex. It's messy. It's complicated because of the choice of a person to take their own life.
Yeah,
and I think that's what made it so much more difficult, because in spite of best efforts like Suicide Awareness Month, that it's still stigmatized by the public in general. And then also for those who have experienced the loss of a loved one to suicide, that they may feel guilt and shame for their loved one doing this. And I thought that there's got to be a way to work through this, and that to be able to move forward and move through this tragedy. And so when I started doing so much more for myself, it's like, oh, wow, because I love to research. And I feel that I am empowered by understanding. And so I researched suicide and the who, the what, the when, where, the how, and then that big question of why. So I did all that research on that and discovered, I had some answers, and I received healing from doing that. And then also, Helen, what I did is I looked at my lifestyle from in the past, how I grew up and what I believe in, and that health and wellness has been important to me, and that accepting my loss and understanding the fear that goes with healing and moving through grief. That was, and then recovery in the 4 areas of health, of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. When I looked at what gave me the ability to move through my loss, was those were foundational. Okay. And bringing that together with my research on suicide and my practical experiences, that's what was like that aha, like, wow, this is my next book. And it's all through personal experience. And then what I bring together to the table is professional experience as a fitness consultant, a coach in helping behavior change, nutrition consultant, wellness coaching, all these things. It empowers us. It makes a difference on how we think about things. So I brought this all together. So it's going to be quite different, my philosophy versus that treatment and therapy that you would get from a traditional psychologist or a therapist. So it's distinctly different. And that's where I was like, this is important enough. This is different because other people are seeking this. They want something different. They found go ahead.
So I think you hit it on the head there. It's your experiences, and there are people out there who are wanting this, because you mentioned something really key earlier about fumbling your way through. You go into these groups and then you get onto that hamster wheel, and it's very difficult to get off that. And like you say, there are so many people that just maybe get stuck in that space. You and I are both the type of people that needed to move through. We needed to find our way. We needed to find some hope, some happiness. And what I love is that, you've gone on this journey yourself to explore it yourself, to find what has worked for you and taken you back to that place. And that's why I think this book is going to be very helpful. you also mentioned, and I just want to tease this out a bit more, about the fear of many people have of moving through grief. Talk to us about that, the fear people have.
Yeah, absolutely, Helen. And so as I break my book out into, I talk about suicide, and I indicate that this is the 3 phases to move through grief to healing. And so the first one is about acceptance. The second one is understanding your fear. And then the third one is the recovery in that physical, mental, and emotional and spiritual, but understanding your fear. As having been a dual child loss survivor, I know and understand that so many people believe that their child is going to be forgotten, that they might even forget their child if they stop being sad, if they stop grieving for them. They fear that that's going to happen. They may fear judgment from others on how they grieve. That can bring about guilt and shame. It's like, oh, you're getting through it too fast. You're not getting through it fast enough. That fear of judgment. And there's so many things with that fear. Is like that the effort that they put into their healing isn't going to work. Like, well, or the fear of the actual pain that it takes to heal. And I'll just share with you an analogy on needing to go through this pain to be able to move forward. And it's just simple. So I was in a car accident a few years ago. I had some injuries to my left hand. I initially went to the emergency room afterwards. They did a diagnosis, took some x-rays. And then the next work day, I went in, had some more evaluations done, determined a little bit more of that injury, put my hand in a cast for some period of time. But then when I got out of that cast, I had to do physical therapy. That physical therapy was painful. It hurt to have to be able to use that hand again. But I knew in my own mind that going through this painful experience was going to get me to the point where I could use my hand again and I wouldn't have pain. And sometimes people have that fear of facing that pain of going, oh, if I look at the pictures, it's going to make me cry. If I'm talking about my child, it's going to upset others.
Yeah.
And it's that it is necessary to experience the loss and experience the pain in order to be able to move forward and feel better. And that can be scary to people. It can be very scary to face that and go, is it worth it? And then also just even simply the way I've seen some people think about is that it's just, they believe that they can't move forward, that the fear of what they do is judged, the fear that it's not right, that they don't deserve to be able to live life again, continue life. And Helen, this is just, a little bit of a sidebar and we've come to this point in culture and society that we think that there's a chronological order of death. For the most part, there is.
Yeah.
But it's not guaranteed.
Yeah.
And it's tough and we think that there's, a misorder of death. True, we expect to outlive our parents, that children pass after us, but there's no guarantee on that.
Yeah.
And being able to understand that this loss of a child before a parent is part of just life. And it's tough. I totally agree with that. But if we let go of that expectation that it's just life, then it helps us to understand it's okay. And it's okay to move forward.
Yes. So important that. So we're going to flip around to that in just a moment, but that was such a good analogy that you used of therapy and needing to go through that pain to get. It's exactly what we need to do here. Face that tough stuff. So when we spoke last time, you talked about radical acceptance, and I really loved that. It really had a ding ding moment for me when I heard you speaking about radical acceptance. So you mentioned that the first step in this three phase that you've got in this book is acceptance. So is that radical acceptance again? Does it go hand in hand, or can you
Yeah,
just talk
it's
to us
actually
about that?
expanding that idea of that
Oh, good.
acceptance.
Good.
Yeah, and so I find that to accept the circumstances that this has happened, and no matter how much wishing, praying, hoping, meditation, we cannot bring that person back alive. And so
Yes.
simply being able to accept that this has happened, because denial is not going to be able to move us forward. So on the big umbrellas, just accept that this has happened,
Yeah.
and giving yourself permission to grieve, because I think that falls under the acceptance. And for me, an example is when I decided to accept that I would grieve. I gave myself permission to grieve whenever and wherever. So if I happened to be driving down the road and it hit, I would let it flow. If I was at the grocery store and something triggered me, I would let it flow. If I was having a conversation with a friend, because we're meant to feel these emotions. And just like I told you, we just talked about that analogy of healing, after in physical therapy. Healing comes from remembering people, feeling that pain, but giving ourselves permission to feel it and to grieve and not live up to other people's expectations.
But I think
Feel
that's the
shame.
problem, that we've been so conditioned that we're supposed to suppress these feelings, that we're not allowed to show them openly, that it's going to upset others if we suddenly burst out crying and they don't know the reason why. Yeah, it's not about those others. It's about what we need to do for ourselves. And so we're denying a lot of those feelings ourselves. And so
Absolutely.
how do we give ourselves permission to do that?
I really think even saying I'm giving myself permission and accept that it's going to happen. Say, yes, I'm going to give myself permission to grieve and feel uncomfortable with the uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
and understand that. But then also giving yourself permission to heal, to say it's okay that I can experience peace, joy, and happiness again. I can sleep. I can eat again. I can love again. I can remember. Giving yourself permission to heal, to do those things that life is about. You can say that you can have hopes and dreams. You can remember your loved one. Now, life is different. We wish that it wouldn't be that way, but it's different, and accepting that, but giving yourself that and regain the you that was lost.
Yes.
To be able to give yourself permission to do that. And we can hold ourselves back, and society can hold us back. And so it's really been to stand in your grief, in your moment, in your truth, in your honesty, and say, this is where I am. I've accepted this. I'm going to give myself permission to heal. And if that means working with somebody to help you, finding the proper grief group that works, those are important things.
They are. But also hand in hand with that acceptance, I think, is, like you touched on it earlier, is the immense guilt. And particularly in this form of grief, suicide, where somebody has taken their own life. And there are so many what ifs. What if I just given them the time the day before when they asked for it? Or what if I just gone to see them and check in on them? What if, look, you could go down many, many rabbit holes with the what ifs. How do people address this huge, immense guilt that seems to go hand in hand with suicide?
Yeah, Helen, and those are very legitimate questions. They happen, the thoughts and feelings. And that's where understanding the suicide, and it's unfortunate we are not alone on this journey. There are others that have experienced it and have been able to walk through it. But I think understanding it and that why, and you were saying what if. When I was working with the chaplain personally through Connor's suicide, he said, I asked, well, what if I had done this? What if I had spoken him to the day of? What if I had done this? What if I, he reversed that simply and asked, as if I had done this, would it have made a difference?
Yes.
And one of my favorite tools in suicide to help others is the 3 C's. And actually, these 3 C's come from 12-step groups. Yeah. I've been exposed to them with family members who've been alcoholics. And so I have participated in the partner program for these as a family member. So the 3 C's is cure, cause, and control. Were we able to cure our loved ones' families, our loved ones' problems? My son, could I cure the problems that he had? He was 24 and he was in some sort of pain I think it was more of an emotional distress, but I couldn't cure them. Did I cause those problems? No, I did not cause his problems. Those are things that he took responsibility for. And then control. He was old enough that I couldn't control what he was going through. I couldn't control his circumstances. He had full control over those. And so to stand in a circle the size of a hula hoop, you put it on the ground and look around that, and you got a 3-foot radius. That's what, as a person, I can control. I can't control others. And when we give that control up, and no matter the best we did, I've talked to plenty of people who did their best, and especially in circumstances with mental health, they did their best in getting their loved one the help they need. But ultimately, it was their loved one's choice. It was their loved one's decision, in spite of their best effort. So I think realizing and saying, we did our best in helping with this. But we couldn't hear it, we couldn't control it, and we did not cause it. And can be a tough concept. And I've heard from many people, though, that this concept is very, very impactful when it comes to suicide. You're like, yes, yes, yes. It is so impactful that it makes a big difference.
Liberating and empowering as well.
Yeah, even to sit down and write this out. I did not cause this to happen. I did not have control. Okay?
Yes. Just as you were talking about it, I could feel the power behind those 3 C's alone, and just releasing somebody from guilt. Yes, those are a lot of things we had absolutely no control over. And I've often heard, with loved ones who have passed by suicide, that nobody had the faintest idea they were about to do that. They knew they were going through struggles. They knew they had problems. But, the actual timing was a very private, personal, in the moment, it's done. And that is something that nobody has any control over. So it's
absolutely. And Helen, my son had some struggles. He was 24 and he was getting started into his career. He had some relationships that, weren't the best, but I didn't think that they were that bad. And just getting established as a young gentleman, and I had no idea that things were that bad. And the circumstances of the day that he took his life, I think just got too heavy. And then he had some that it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't think he planned on doing it that day. Now there are circumstances where others do, but in my particular circumstances with my son, I don't believe that he planned to do it that day.
I'm going to share something with you, which, very few people ever know about me. And I remember a time when my daughter was just in her early teens, and I was just trying to juggle everything. I was on my own with her. She's a very strong, willful child. We were busy 24/7, weekends, and I was working, hugely busy at work, and life got on top of me. And I remember it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. We had an argument. It was a really wild, wintry day, and I remember the night was so wild. And I remember hopping in my car and making that decision that, okay, this is too much for me. I made it in a split decision. And I really got to the point where I was nearly going to do it. And then what held me back was, no, she still needs me. No matter how shitty it is at this moment, she still needs me. So I pulled back. But I know how very, very close I was to making that decision in that split moment. And that would have surprised the hell out of everybody who knew me. But that's how easy it is. And that's how it can sometimes happen. And luckily, I got to come back from it and, be with her and support her. And I don't regret that for one moment. And she knew I'd reached that point too. She didn't actually share with me until sometime later. But she just said to me, Mum, make me a promise when it gets that tough that, we deal with it. So in another way.
Thank you for sharing that, Helen.
Yeah, but I think people need to hear how easy and sometimes out of everyone's control it is when you just make that split moment decision when everything aligns. So, and I just truly believe from the bottom of my heart, it is not an easy thing for somebody to do. That's the hardest decision in the world to actually go through with something like that. And I think you must be feeling immense, deep hurt and despair in that moment. And I know other people are going to have other opinions about it, but that's just my personal opinion. I think it's so good to talk about this because that came out of nowhere from me, and I think it's good for people to hear as well.
Well, and with that, Helen, I'll just add on to that. And you were able to logically think about it and say, I've got my daughter to think about. But there are resources. And I know that you're in New Zealand. I'm in the United States. And the United States just instituted a 3-digit number. It's 988 for help and for crises. And so, as we talk about this, that others can reach out, and there are helplines, reach out to a trusted friend when you're in that moment. They would rather be interrupted in their sleep to give you help rather than to be interrupted in their sleep to hear the news that you've taken your life. Yeah. And so to all those that are listening, if you get to that point, seek some help. The police station, the fire station, the hospital, whatever. If you're at that point and just say, you know what, I just need to talk and some help.
So we often say too that, people don't care, but actually I think that's wrong. That statement, there are an awful lot of people out there who do care, who are willing to give you that time and support that you need if you're going through anything like that. So don't hold off, don't share the burden alone. And I think, as soon as you start to share it, suddenly it becomes not as burden. Oh, I'm going to try and say that word and it's not going to come out. It's not as heavy a load to carry once you start to talk to somebody about it, and you can just see some glimmer of hopes and some ways to get through it. So the third phase you discuss in your book is recovery. So when you talk recovery, Peggy, what does that mean?
And thanks, Helen. Absolutely. In recovery, I discovered is whole health. And so I consider myself to be a holistic author, holistic grief coach. And what I mean, not in the, meditative style with an H, but it's WH, WHOLISTIC, holistic, where we look at you as a whole person. And this is another reason why, said, well, why did I write this book? Well, traditional therapy just focuses mostly on the brain. okay, in the way maybe how we think. But knowing what has brought me through this is the physical health. And we look at the physical health and what impact that has on our mental health. And whether you exercise and get some blood flowing, help to reduce your depression by producing endorphins, and helps to reduce fatigue. And when that happens, your brain starts to think clearer and you reduce the brain fog, and then you can think about life differently. And then into the spiritual. I believe that we all have a higher power. My higher power is God, but your higher power does not have to be God. We believe that there's something out there that's greater than us that explains the unexplainable.
Yeah.
And having that higher power with all of these. So we talk about in the physical, and believe me, having worked in physical fitness for 14 years, bringing together that physical with our exercise, but also our nutrition component. And because if we're eating comfort foods, great. It's a short-term solution, because then the sugars, the fats, and the salts ultimately make us feel worse, cause problems the way we think, and adds to the depression. And so really focusing on those physical components, I believe, is just so forgotten that traditional therapy just forgets and doesn't look at us as a whole person. So the holistic component and combining all of these, even I've had somebody simple who felt like they couldn't even get up and walk, but we start out with simply walk to the mailbox at the end of the driveway and come back. And then the next time, walk to the neighbor's mailbox and come back. And then get to the point of even taking one lap around the block. The sunshine, the vitamin D that they get from it, and then possibly even some community, some exposure to be able to say hello to somebody else on the street, on that sidewalk, and just to have that interaction instead of isolating. One of the things that we can do is we can be ashamed of what's happened, shameful that they've taken their life. And having community and having others support us helps to reduce that shame.
Yeah. So what's going to help somebody who is feeling that deep shame about what has happened? How do they take those first steps of reaching out to get that support they need? Because that's a biggie. That's huge to move through.
It is, and people feel guilty about it. And I really think that being able to share your story, much like I've done, or even going back to the first phase we spoke about, is accepting that this has happened and using those 3 C's and saying, okay, I couldn't cause, cure, or control this. And so, understanding that these are not linear, but I personally found that acceptance was huge, but that they are a cat and mouse in how you use these tools, and that you just don't say, okay, I've accepted and I'm done and I'm going to move on to understanding my fear, because you may need to come back and revisit the acceptance of giving yourself permission to grieve. But then you may do some physical exercise and how that helps you. But it's being able to take responsibility for yourself. You can't control other people. You can control yourself. You can control the way you think. In sharing your journey, seeking help. I mean, Helen, my book, and this isn't just to say that I think that it's good because it's my book, but that's part of it. But the tools in there are so helpful that it's like, oh, wow, this makes sense. This is practical. She's used this. It's not theory. It's practical experience. And being able to step into this and looking at it and go, okay, this is causing me to want to isolate. Isolation is not the key to healing. No. Community, sharing, talking about it helps.
So I know that what you're saying is so very, very right, because in my early days of losing Tal, I didn't actually want to talk so much about what had happened and the details and those types of things. But what I did, a bit further on was like I used to walk and walk. And that walking alone was so healing. Like I didn't have to explain to somebody what I was feeling and why I was feeling that and how I was going to feel differently. I didn't want to do that stuff. But just walking actually helped make things start to click in my head and make me feel better. And so as soon, like you say, that vitamin D, getting out on the beautiful day, looking at all the things you're surrounded by, that alone energized me and gave me enough hope to say, okay, I'm ready for the next step. Okay, let's take that on, or let's move forward. And that's when you're ready for those resources that are available. And I think it's so good that you're talking about resources that are available, because sometimes we forget or we don't know where to go to find them. So that's why in this podcast, there's always the episode notes where we share the links to your website and places like that, which are rich with resources. And I thank you so much for that, Peggy, very much. You just were talking about, and I'm going to paraphrase it for you, because really what you're talking about is that we make a conscious decision to heal. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because it's never about minimizing or negating what has happened, but it's about, like you say, accepting the situation, knowing that we couldn't change the situation, and knowing that, yes, our life is going to never be the same, but what do we need it to look like going forward? So again, just share with us your insights on that conscious decision to heal.
Well, Helen, I think that is so much comes from our society, and part of it's just even the fact that we have so many people who working moms, and that, our employers give us 3 days off. Like, oh, you got 3 days and you're supposed to be back to work. And it's like, you know what? I've just had a child pass away, and to give that expectation, but it's really understanding that we can grieve and that it's important to grieve.
Yeah. And I'm just going to sit with that a moment, because that is truly what it's about. And I think sometimes we have to start speaking up for what it is we need, and help change some of those stupid regulations around thinking that you can lose a child and in 3 days be back to functioning at work again. The reality is that is far from the truth, and you actually need some really good strategies to be able to return to work and know what you're capable of doing and what you're not. I know for me, I was in tremendous brain fog, but more than that, I couldn't handle being around people. I was in an open plan office, and I did not want to be surrounded by people. And my boss actually allowed me he found an office and he said, yeah, go hang out there, Helen. So it's all these unexpected things that suddenly we start feeling, and that we have to sort of navigate and come to terms with. But more than that, I think another thing that we don't often think about is that, we've got these parents who are facing losing a child, and that often there are siblings in that equation as well. And so how do we go about supporting those siblings who, I don't know, can sometimes be left out of that equation and not being supported as well? Because I think the overwhelm of what has happened, we somehow expect them just to, I don't know, manage it. And why are we expecting children to manage something that we're not even managing well?
Right. Boy, Helen, and having that. So I do have 2 girls that are living. I have 2.5 grandchildren. And I mean by that is that I have another one coming.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. And it's exciting. But understand that the relationship, the grief in between a mother and a sibling is quite different. And, so what I learned for myself is to definitely give myself that permission to grieve whenever. And I learned not to lean heavily onto my girls. I shared my grief with them, but knowing that their grief as a sibling was different, I chose support for myself. So we grieved together, but then also grieved separately. And then to give them that support in helping them to work through it, in helping them to connect to others, and to work through that, and the two siblings to be able to connect as well was important. And to help them to realize that there's that future. And for me, it's been also by living by example that I've been that role model in being able to say, yes, you can make it through that. You don't have to write books. You don't have to do podcasts. You don't have to be an inspirational speaker. But setting that role model, just even, like I said, there would be times that I would just have to sit down and cry. And my girls saw that and they knew what it was about. And so being that role model, I believe, was huge. Talking about my son, sharing the same techniques that I've used that they can apply for themselves. One of the things I like to use as well is take what you like and leave the rest when it comes to these tools. Okay.
Yes.
I do suggest that you at least mindfully try and experience each one of these tools. And you may find that one works better than another, but really experiencing them, because it gives you a very full toolbox.
Yeah.
And to let them see that. And as you know, the recovery piece where I talk about the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Well, they've been around that growing up because that's the lifestyle that I've lived. And that's what's enabled me to navigate the multitude of losses. I haven't mentioned this before, but, in between Courtney's death and Connor's death, I've had both parents, my sister, cousins, and 3 other young adults die by suicide.
Wow.
And it's, yes.
Yeah.
And my daughter, my oldest daughter, 2 of those were her friends, and one was one of my nieces. And so that we've been exposed to this and how I've navigated all this. And that's where, to be able to pull together all the resources that I've been able to get through this multitude of losses. And it's how I've thought and that I've exercised. And I continue to work with other coaches, which help me to further better myself, to understand myself, to think in a positive way. It's not something that's just happened naturally. I continue to work with others. And I think that's one of the things when it comes to we briefly touched upon this, is the shame, that it's shaming to need help. Well, to be able to reach out to others and to be able to move through this, there's nothing wrong against it. And it's that opportunity to get the help that you need, because like I said, our culture has changed. We're expected to go back to work. Families are dispersed. We're no longer this tribal unit of close support. People move across the state. They move across the country. They move to other countries. And so physically, we just don't have that same support. And so looking at alternative resources and be able to work with like a grief coach, a grief specialist, such as myself, makes a huge difference. That we can, you don't have to have that shame. And the people that I have worked with really appreciate it, and that they've been able to lift that cloud of shame and despair and desperation, that they now see peace, joy, and happiness. And their family, not only have they regained who they were, but their family has gotten them back.
Yes.
And to find your why, and usually making it an internal why, it's like for ourselves, but then we can also, just like you did not go through the act of taking your own life because you thought about your daughter and those who deserve to have you. I love this one statement for myself. There's one person in this life that's worth living for. And that one person is you. You deserve to live for yourself.
Oh my gosh, that's very, very powerful, Peggy. And I'm so pleased we've been so open about this. And Do you think that we're in a society where there are more suicides happening? Is it the pressure and the disconnection and all the pressures that seem to be coming at us from every which way? And are we getting, or is it that we're sort of just reducing the stigma around it and talking about it more openly? I don't know. What's your perspective on that?
Well, looking at suicide statistics, I definitely believe that that is on the rise. And especially as we're coming out of the COVID pandemic, because that COVID created isolation, despair, desperation. And, along with that, people were losing their jobs and finances were a huge issue. So I believe that they're on the rise. And unfortunately, once a person has been exposed to the suicide of somebody they know, their risk of taking their own life by suicide increases because it is seeing the solution that they came up with. And so for Connor, he was 14 when his cousin took her life. Probably a couple years later, when his older sister's friends took their lives, having been exposed to it, it looks like a simple and easy solution.
Yeah.
And I believe that they're on the rise. Statistics are rising. And yes, there's more of that awareness, but when we have the reported statistics, that's a little bit harder to dispute. And then, unfortunately, one of the things that's being tossed into that suicide statistic is questionable as to whether or not when somebody's dying by fentanyl, was that intentional or not? And that they're receiving that. But firearms are being used now. I mean, that was the latest statistic, I think, from 2020 in more suicides than homicides. And that's just, on the rise, and that it's a solution. And it's hard to see that. We have people who are definitely working on creating resources, suicide awareness and prevention. And unfortunately, it does happen. And with my experience, that's where I am here, is to help others who've gone through it.
And I'm very glad you are. And I'm very glad that you're taking a stand and doing it from your own personal experience, because we need these resources out there. We need people being able to read about how to navigate this, because, some of the stats I heard, and it's just when you touched on this, there are about 134 or more people affected by any one suicide, and there are 10 to 12 very closely affected by any one suicide. And if we're having it happen more and more, that means that we are all being exposed to this happening around us. So we don't want to normalize it as an option, a go-to, that we actually have to work out some other strategies and use some different resources to cope with this. And I love that you mentioned being a role model for your girls, that they could see you, how you were living and how you were trying to find hope and happiness in your life. And so that gave them the way forward, whether it was conscious or subconscious. And so I think that's what people need to believe when you're talking about it, taking responsibility for it, being open about it. You don't know who you are inspiring and giving hope to, and the courage that somebody else can also be enacted in that way. Oh my gosh, Peggy, what else do we need to know about this?
Oh, Helen, just seems like an awesome oxymoron type of thing to say, that I'm so happy to be able to talk about it. And it's because I've accepted that my son is gone. I'm doing this in his honor. He would be proud of what I'm doing and helping others. And it's important to be able to do this. And so, what's come out of it for me is to be that role model. And, I have my 2 books, and the first one is Life After Child Loss, the Mother Survival Guide to Cope and Find Joy. The second one dives deeper into suicide and these 3 phases I spoke about. and that survive your child suicide, how to move through grief to healing. And then, the other things that I do is that I help individuals one-on-one, working with them as a grief specialist and working through these specific things and helping them to gain that confidence that they too can do this, and talking about acceptance and the suicide and fear and helping with those recovery pieces. So as a grief specialist and grief coach, I help others do that. And then finally, being that role model and being the inspiration for others who need to hear this message, in that there is hope and healing after loss, that there's inspiration when life gets tough, for groups that want to hear this. If it's your church group, if you want to hear about this, or your conference that wants to hear about this, I have experienced it, and to show and demonstrate that you can make through this. And so, the best way to reach out to me is through my website. And that's actually The Grief Specialist, Grief, GRIEF Specialist. And I know in the beginning of the show here, Helen, you mentioned 2 E's. Well, since we last spoke, I've made some changes and changed it from 2 E's to 1 because people weren't finding me. And it's that important that I wanted people to find me. Now, if you go with 2 E's, that's okay. It'll redirect you. But thegriefspecialist.com, there's resources. I have Thursday Thoughts where I publish a weekly blog. You can sign up for that. You can sign up for a coaching session with me. Check out my other resources, and if you're interested in, I have other podcasts on there, but it's just really meant to serve others and help you to be able to make it through that. But please share this podcast with others. Helen's got so much good information, not just mine, but the other resources that she shares. She shares her story. So there's somebody out there, like you said, there's 10 to 12 people that are impacted by the suicide death of one person. So you could be impacted, or you can know somebody else that is. So share. Don't keep resources to yourself.
Okay, now we're going to finish off with a couple of quick-fire questions very shortly, but before we go there, I just wanted to give people some stats on suicide, because this is mind-blowing. There are over 703,000 people who die by suicide worldwide each year, and over 1 in every 100 deaths, and this is from 2019 research, was as a result of suicide. And the suicide rate is over twice as high among men than women. And over half, 58% of all deaths by suicide occur before the age of 50 years old. So if you think you know somebody who's at risk of this, please just reach out, support them, just be that kind, loving, friendly person that they can turn to in their time of need. That's what I most want to put out there as well. So, Peggy, I always ask this now on my podcast, maybe not when we first interviewed you, but what is the best thing that has happened to you so far today?
The best thing. Oh, well, today has been a beautiful day. It's a beautiful fall day here, and I spent some quality time with my youngest daughter. Wonderful. And so that's been amazing, just spending that quality time with her.
Oh, I love it. What is your proudest moment to date?
Oh, gosh. Wow. I would say, I have plenty of proud moments, but I think about the recent, and that is actually publishing in my second book and being able to serve others. I think just helping them through their grief, through their suicide, loss, child suicide. Very proud of that.
Yes. A good reason to be very proud. What's your go-to? What's your go-to when your day turns a little bit dark? When you have those moments where, things are not going right, how do you pivot yourself out of those?
Walking, getting outdoors, getting grounded.
Practicing what you preach.
Yes, I really do, because the fresh air and just being outdoors is so critically important. I go back to when I was a kid. As soon as the snow had lifted enough and I could go outside and sit up against the side of my house and bask in the southern, in the sunshine on the southern side of the house, I would do that. I remember doing that as a kid. So running, bicycling, hiking, those are the things. And even if it's just a walk that I don't have the time to be able to take a hike and get to the mountains and hike, but outdoors. Yes, I practice what I preach.
Yes, something magical about this earth when we get out there amongst the trees, or just feeling that sun on us, or the wind, or walking through the grass. I tell you, it's magical. It has very, very strong healing powers, I believe. Peggy, I just want to thank you so much for your time today, just to have a real heart-to-heart, open conversation about this wonderful book that you've written, but also about, this whole topic of suicide and how we can navigate through it in a much more healthier, positive way. And those 3 C's, they are gold nuggets. But, just everything you've talked about has been really, really positive. So I encourage everyone just to check out the links that I'm going to put in the episode notes, so that you can go and check out all those wonderful things Peggy talked about her one-on-one coaching, speaking to groups if you're a group that wants to hear more about this and her experiences, or to find out more about the wonderful books that she's written. Look, I'm going to have all those links. So please just go check them out. Peggy, one last parting comment that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would say that there's hope. Please just remember there is hope. There's others that have traveled this journey, and you can too, and make that decision. I think it's really about making a decision and understanding that you have hope. You can walk through this too.
Beautiful. Thank you so very, very much.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's been delightful, and thank you for sharing.
Thanks for listening. I hope you got some real value from this episode. Let me know how I'm doing, or if there's a topic you'd like covered, by clicking on the Healing to Be You Gmail link, or going to the Healing to Be You website. To get notified of new episodes, hit the subscribe button, and please share if you know of someone who could benefit from this episode. Until next time, be kind to you and take good care.